Good afternoon. My name is Kathleen Lugerich, and I'm the Manager of Visitor Engagement and Programs for the Army Historical Foundation. The Foundation's mission is to honor the American soldier by preserving and presenting the history and heritage of the United States Army. The Foundation is also the official foundation for the National Museum of the United States Army. Today, we will remember and honor the story of Chinese American soldiers from World War II. A panel led by the Foundation's chief historian, Matt Seelinger, will discuss their journey from enlistment and wartime experiences to the 2018 award of the Congressional Gold Medal. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Samantha Chang is an experienced journalist and documentarian and the co-founder of Heritage Series LLC, a company that specializes in educational programs about U.S. ethnic minorities and their contribution to U.S. history. She is the author of Honor and Duty, the Chinese American World War II Veterans. Commander Evelyn Moy served in the U.S. Navy Reserve and retired as a full commander in 2010. She has a Bachelor of Science from the University of Maryland and a Master's from the Naval War College. Commander Moy is president of the Moy Family Association in Washington, D.C., and a member of the OCA, Reserve Officer Association, and several American Legion posts. Past National Commander of the American Legion, Feng Wang, was born in Canton, China, and immigrated to the United States in November 1960 at the age of 12. He has been a naturalized citizen since January 1963. In addition to his Vietnam service, he has also served tours of duty in Germany, Korea, and several stateside military posts. He retired from the Army in May 1989 and was elected as the American Legion National Commander from 2011 to 2012. And today's host is Matt Seelinger, the Chief Historian of the Army Historical Foundation and editor of the Foundation's magazine, On Point. He holds a Bachelor's in History from James Madison University and a Master's in History from Ball State University. He has worked for the Army Historical Foundation since 1997. To you, Matt.
Thank you, Kathleen. Welcome to our panelists and those joining us online today. Today we are going to discuss the experiences of Chinese American soldiers during World War II. To give you a sense of who these soldiers were, we're going to watch a short clip featuring the photos of these veterans. Samantha, how did your work on Chinese American veterans begin?
Thank you, Matt, for asking that question. So my research into the Chinese American World War II vets actually began when I produced and directed a documentary called Honor and Duty, the Mississippi Delta Chinese. And through the research of Dr. Gwendolyn Gong, she was able to identify a very significant number of Chinese Americans who hail from the state of Mississippi in the Delta that kisses the Mississippi River. After that program was released in 2016, I started looking into more Chinese American World War II veteran stories. And I actually worked with your organization, the Army Heritage Foundation and the Association of the U.S. Army, to look into the contribution of Chinese Americans and actually all Asian Americans who served in the military. From there, I had met a general named Major General Tony Taguba, who encouraged me to explore the contributions of Chinese Americans and look into whether or not Congress would consider an act to honor and recognize the Chinese American World War II vets. About a decade ago, the Japanese Americans had received a Congressional Gold Medal. And in 2016, the Filipino Americans had received their Congressional Gold Medal for their service in World War II. So both those Asian American entities had done what we were exploring for the Chinese American servicemen and women. And we put together an exploratory committee at the end of 2016 to see if in the 115th Congress there would be interest in passing an act, and which they did. So after the positive response of the exploratory committee, we put together a full-fledged organization with the support of many affinity groups in the community. It took a village to create this movement of Chinese American contribution to U.S. history through World War II. So that's how my participation started. Thank you for asking, Matt.
My next question is for Fang. Were Chinese Americans fully integrated into the Army and armed forces during World War II, or were they segregated into segregated by race or ethnic groups like African Americans and Japanese, or were they concentrated in any particular branch of the Army?
Thank you, Matt. Far as we could tell based on the records, the majority of the Chinese American do serve in the Army Air Corps area, but we are also spread among the Naval and the Marines, Coast Guards, and whatnot. We are not, far as we know, we are not segregated into a separate unit per se, like the African Americans and also the Japanese, because they were segregated based on various other reasons. If you want to look at it real closely, the only unit that I could point my finger to is the 14th Air Force, where they have a support battalion that primarily made up of the Chinese American soldiers. But they were there for a reason, because of the background, because of the knowledge to the language, and also the culture of the war zone that they were about to enter. Other than that, as far as I know, we have Chinese American soldiers, naval service personnel serve in all theaters throughout the war. And so a lot of time, one of the reasons that you don't hear too much about Chinese American per se is, number one, our number, 20,000, is not a whole lot compared to 1 million service at that time. And then the other thing is that we're not concentrated in any one area, like the 442. They were highlighted because that's where they distinguish themselves. For the Chinese serving in China, a lot of time is being outshined by the 14th Air Force, what they call the Flying Tiger. Everybody want to associate with the Flying Tiger, but then it's very easy to drop the Chinese American portion off that. Matt, that answer your question, or
Yes, thank you.
you're looking for something else that I could,
Okay. Commander Moy, my question to you is do Chinese American soldiers serve predominantly in any particular theater of the war? Were many sent directly to the China-Burma-India theater because of their language skills?
Thanks, Matt. Certainly the scope of warfare is always extremely complex and daunting. And in the battlefield, language, of course, is extremely important in command and control. Now, the thing with China is that there are so many dialects, and even the dialects can vary from village to village. So can you imagine 1 billion people all trying to communicate with each other, and the dialects are all different? And many people are astonished when they think, well, certainly it must be like in America, a Southern accent or a Boston accent, but that's not true. In China, you can't even understand another person from a different region. So when the war started, a lot of the Chinese, because their homeland was being attacked and they were here in the United States, they enlisted and quickly went to help fight the war as translators. So during that time, 40% weren't even US citizens. So, and my mother mentions that when she was little, she was lying face down in the fields because the Japanese were strafing the villages, and her mother sent her to the hills to hide. So the Chinese were very eager to fight this war, and if they had language skills, they enlisted and wanted to get into the fight very quickly. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you. Samantha, where in the United States did most Chinese Americans live at the time the war broke out? And then the Chinese American servicemen, were they mostly draftees, mostly volunteers? Is there a way to determine that?
Okay. In terms of where the Chinese resided in the United States at the onset of World War II, according to the 1940 census, the Chinese who were in the United States at the time concentrated themselves on both coasts, on the East Coast and the West Coast, as far north as the northern states, Maine, Massachusetts, Vermont, New England, that area. New York City was the hub, the cluster, and New York, New Jersey. Then we had large concentrations of Chinese Americans in Illinois and in Texas, and certainly in Alabama, Mississippi, Arkansas, that area, Louisiana. Then we go to the west, where it's in Washington State, Oregon State, and the state of California. California was the heavy population. So in terms of the Chinese Americans who served, I would easily say that New York State and California State were the largest states where we drew our servicemen and women. And I'm going to refer to our servicemen because of the 22,827 World War II vets that we were able to identify, we were only able to identify maybe under 100 of those service personnel were women. The other large concentration of Chinese Americans we have to factor in was from the territory of Hawaii. At the onset of World War II, Chinese living in Hawaii and Alaska were not American citizens because those two were not states yet. They were territories of the United States. So we have about 24,000 Chinese Americans coming from the islands of Hawaii. And what's really interesting in our data is that those Chinese Americans were actually attached to the state of Idaho, because in the wisdom of the military, they didn't know where to put that many Chinese people. It's a huge number, 2,400 Chinese Americans. And for record keeping purposes, they were put in Idaho because Idaho follows H in the alphabet. So that's why we have so many people from Idaho. And because we learned that when we were advocating for the bill for the Chinese American World War II Congressional Gold Medal Act, we had to visit the 2 senators from Idaho and the 2 members of Congress from Idaho. They're like, we love this story. We really want to support your bill, but according to our rosters, our state doesn't have that many Chinese people. And we had to present to them all the data that we were able to uncover through our research that stated that in the state of Idaho, there were, again, 2,400 Chinese that were attached to the state, and we had to explain why. We went to several historians. We actually asked you that question as well. So thank you for bringing that up again. It's sort of some interesting anomalies in our data. Thank you, Matt.
Sure. There was a second part to that. Chinese American servicemen, were they largely draftees, largely volunteers, or through your data, you aren't able to determine that?
Correct. Through our data, we were unable to determine whether or not they were enlisted men or draftees. Everyone had to enlist. That was a requirement of the United States government, that if you were an able-bodied citizen or an able-bodied immigrant, you had to enlist into the armed forces. So a lot of our information comes from enlistment cards, but it does not tell us whether or not that person was conscripted, drafted, commissioned, or enlisted.
Thank you. Fang, since this is an important aspect of the Chinese American experience, can you briefly explain what a paper son is?
Thank you for this great question. Paper son basically just a name attached to a system that was used in the 1900s. If we go back in history, Chinese workers have started working in the United States going back to the 1800s. But during that time, most of them are not considered immigrants. They are workers. They sign contracts with companies to come here to work for X number of years. And then after that, they were supposed to go back to China. They really have no legal status to stay here. But thank you to the big fire in San Francisco, every once in a while, when they burned down all the records of the Chinese immigrants or Chinese workers that were in the United States at that time, all of a sudden, overnight, all the Chinese labor that are working became U.S. citizen because the government have no record to prove otherwise. Because they were granted the citizen status, they were able to go back to China, start a family, and then legally come back. And when they come back to the United States, they can report to the authorities that they got married, they have a family in China, and they also have X number of children. That number may be true or may be increased by whatever the number. And those numbers that are not, those numbers above the actual child is being used to sell to other people that wanted their children to come to the United States. So they are assuming the status of so-and-so's son and then gain entry that way. And doing that is a very popular practice at that time. My family, when I came to the United States at age 12, I first learned that I actually have an uncle, which have no relationship to our family whatsoever. So he is a paper son. He bought from my grandfather the son's quota, the other son's quota that we're not being used. So that's how the paper son got started. And that also increased to a lot of confusion nowadays with identity problem. How do we identify who's who? And we have folks question Samantha from time to time, how do we track down my ancestors? Because the names may not be right. That's about the best way I could describe the paper son.
I'm going to jump in, Matt, and explain something a little further.
Sure.
So there was no clear path to citizenship for Chinese living in the United States. If you were not born here under the 14th Amendment, you could not be a citizen. So we had a very unique bachelor society in the early 1940s. Again, through the Paper Sun initiative, I have to call it an initiative because there's no other way to explain it. It was a very unique opportunity because of the Chinese language. There was no path to citizenship. There was no quota that Chinese people can legally come here unless they were a merchant, a scholar, a diplomat. It's very, very difficult to enter the United States legally. So because of the language differences and the fact that it was really difficult bookkeeping data to track people down, that's how the Chinese Paper Sun movement was able to take place and create this very unique community of men in the United States. Matt?
Okay, thank you. Fang, I have another question for you. Can you discuss the
Yes.
impact military service had on the Chinese American community after World War II?
Well, it's tremendous impact, no question about it. Just like Samantha mentioned earlier, prior to World War II, we have this bachelor society, strictly men, and therefore, you don't really have any possibility of growing. What you set with a number, basically that's the number you're going to deal with. Because of the World War II GI benefits, because of the repairing of the Chinese Exclusion Act, we were able to get to the United States many family members, wife, young children. So you transform a bachelor society into a more common American community where you have a family started, and with the returned veterans of the World War II, they enjoy the benefit of the GI Bill. Many got their college education, many get the loans to start their business, and many receive money to purchase a new home. And with that, they were the forerunner and the leader of all the Chinese community throughout the United States. And they are basically the bridge that gaps the East with the West. And back in the 60s, 70s, I grew up in Chinatown, and you look at the veterans, especially the American Legion veterans, because it's a big organization in Chinatown. They are the mover and shaker of how the direction of the Chinese community go. And they are the one that pushing the Chinese community into the mainstream, even though we're still trying to get into mainstream, but they are the one that actually start to kick off and said, we need to join this. Here are the things that we could apply. So they are the one that I give a lot of credit to, that particular greatest generation. They're the one that started all the major metropolitan Chinese communities, and then also all the Chinese American that are enjoying the status, the educations, and all the advancement throughout, this country. Matt.
Thank you. Commander Moy, did your father's service in World War II influence your decision to join the military?
Thank you, Matt. Oh, most definitely. I just want to mention that with the Chinese, again, our names, sometimes the Chinese had 2 or 3 names. So because the last name became the first name in the Chinese culture. So my dad had 3 names, my mother had 2 names. But when my father came over, he listed himself as his Chinese name with, thank heavens, his last name ended up being the last name. So we're a highly patriotic family because of my dad. He always said he was going to be the best at whatever he could be in the military. And so we had an American flag always flying in our home. And my mother was a war bride. As a result, my 2 brothers and I both served, and we all served in our family, actually. And my mother came over on the USS Marine Lynx, which was a troop transport. So throughout our family's history, the theme of the military all originated from my father's service in World War II. Thank you.
Thank you. Samantha, you are the author of the Honor and Duty Project. Can you give us a sense of how you compiled the book? What resources did you rely on? And what challenges did you face throughout the process?
Okay. So this book, Honor and Duty, the Chinese American World War II Veterans, is a compilation. It is a compendium of all the resources we're able to exhaust in a research project that took almost 4 years time to complete. This compendium consists of data that comes from the National Archives, which is the spine of our documentation of our database. Then we relied heavily on a paid service through Ancestry.com, which is called Fold3. It's a military data site. But we also tapped into data sites all across the country, all across the World Wide Web. We tapped into the American Monuments and Battlements Commission, which deals with all the cemeteries, the military cemeteries across the United States. We were able to tap into Chinese-centric military organizations. And what I mean by that is there were several Cathay, quote unquote, Cathay posts, CATHAY posts across the country. Mostly they were American Legion posts, but there were 1 or 2 veteran of foreign war posts. And we were able to reach out to those groups and review their membership rosters, which gave us the lead to then cross-reference with the NARA data and the Fold3 data. There's a clear listing of our methodologies and protocols used and established throughout this project. It was very critical for us to be able to cross-reference this data because we didn't want anyone to say, you know, the Chinese didn't serve. You know, how could they serve? The Japanese Americans were interned, African Americans were in segregated groups. There were no Chinese. We don't know of any Chinese. And you know what? There were a lot of Chinese who served. 22,827 at last count. And this is a continuing project. We have about 6 more years left of the projected 10 years to create this resource, and we will continue to do so. The challenges that we came across were, what Commander Moy had suggested, the last names were different. We had so many aliases. You know, what Fang spoke about, which in turn were the paper sons. No one really wanted to share that data. There was a level of embarrassment from member veteran families. They didn't want to speak of their service because they were here, quote unquote, legally, but really illegally. We relied heavily on primary source material that were published by other local, regional-centric community organizations. For example, in Tucson, there's a Chinese community center in Tucson, Arizona, and they shared with our team their wall of honor, and their wall of honor included veterans who served in World War I, in World War II, the Korean War, up into the Vietnam War. And we were able to take that information, identify the gentleman who served in World War II, and then cross-reference that data with other sources. We were also very fortunate that people shared with us information from really unique organizations. There was a club in San Francisco called the Chick-Char Musical Group. And we learned of them through a family in Michigan who shared with us their actual yearbook of 1946 of the Chick-Char, what they called the Chick-Char memoir. And in that book were hundreds of World War II servicemen and women, their photographs, their branch of service, not always their rank, not as complete data as that we were able to provide in Honor and Duty, the Chinese American World War II vets, but certainly enough to give us a lead. It was like in research, in academic research, there's a term called snowball or the snowball effect. So every time we were able to touch a source, it snowballed into yet another source. So our data is phenomenal, and it's a compendium of everyone else's hard work. We were just the first to bring it all together and make it accessible. This is the only resource available that we are aware of the Chinese Americans who served in World War II in all 5 branches of the armed forces, as well as the United States Merchant Marine Corps. Matt?
Okay, thank you. Last question for all of you. We'll start with Fang.
Yes.
What do you think the younger generation of veterans can learn from the World War II generation?
Well, it's a good question. There's a lot that the younger generation can learn. I just happen to look back at the last 2 decades, ever since the Gulf War. I noticed that more and more Chinese Americans are joining the service, which is a great thing. But then you look at closely, those folks that are joined for the Gulf War, they are really new immigrants, recently immigrated to the United States from China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, whatever. When they came, they actually have no connections with the old Chinatown history. So therefore, it's important for them to learn that they are not the one that are setting history. There are thousands and thousands have served before them, and also those thousands and thousands are the ones that's creating the Chinatown the way it is now. And I think they need to know that that's the root that they need to connect why they are here. And then from there to realize that the responsibility and the job ahead is to continue the march of the second World War II generation to keep on expanding the Chinese Americans in all facets of life cycle within the United States, and be proud of it, because now we could turn around and point at the 22,000 names as a proof, as a backing that this is where we're from, this is why we serve proudly. Matt?
Commander Moy.
Thanks, Matt. Well, the younger generation and the Chinese American youth, they have to really understand the history of how we got here, our journey, and that journey has been very hard and painful. It's been paid for by the sacrifice and dedication and the blood loss of those veterans who died in the duty of serving our nation. So for myself, it was the best decision of my entire life, bar none. Wearing the cloth of the nation, the uniform of the United States Navy, really gave me a huge sense of pride. And I would say to the young people, when you think of how you're going to live your life here in the United States as an American, think about service to country and think seriously about joining the military. Thank you, Matt.
And Samantha.
I think the takeaway from this project and from this discussion as a whole is the fact that we can share with our young Chinese and our young Asian Americans is that they're not alone, that they're not the first to feel the sense of isolation, that there are elders that came before them, not to discount what they're feeling potentially emotionally about being Chinese or being Asian in the United States. We cannot change what we look like, but we are just as American as the next person. So what I hope to take away from this subject is that you're not alone, you're not the first, and you're certainly not going to be the last. But people, you are here on the backs of our elders who served in World War II and made it an opportunity for you to immigrate to, and your families to immigrate to the United States and to live the quality of life that you have right now. You have to remember the Chinese Exclusion Act did not repeal until 1943. So there were no Chinese here legally unless you were a merchant, scholar, or a diplomat. And those statuses were very, very difficult to obtain. So we are still an emerging and burgeoning community here in the United States. And our young people should know that they're here because of our forefathers. We have to thank them and remember that it is a privilege to be a US citizen and that service to country and service to nation is very important.
Okay.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you very much. Thank you all so much for answering all of my questions. Next, Commander Moy, President of the Moy Family Association in Washington, D.C., will provide a presentation about her father and other members of the Moy clan who served in World War II. Commander Moy, over to you.
Thanks, Matt. Our family's journey began in February 1939 when my father came to the United States on the SS Belle Isle. The manifest lists him as being 16 years old, son of a native and a U.S. citizen. He came over when the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was in full effect. And during that time, only 150 Chinese were allowed into the country, and they had to be either a merchant, a diplomat, or a student. So my dad, of course, came in as a student. 2 years later, he signed the military registration card that you see in the middle. Then afterwards, he enlisted in the Coast Guard. He was assigned to the Coast Guard training station close by, over here in Curtis Bay in Baltimore, Maryland. And Curtis Bay served as a training boot camp. So as a steward's mate first class, my dad joined the ranks of the other minorities, such as the Black, African Americans and Filipino. And if you were white, you were not allowed to be stewards at that time. And Dad was busy serving the officers' meals during their laundry and cleaning their decks. And the next slide. But the most important job was his other training, which was being a warfighter. Every Coast Guardsman was trained to fight the enemy. So he was trained to be a gunner, a loader, and an ammunition passer. The steward's mate, whether on the seas or on land, had a war-fighting job. So in the next slide, where did the Chinese come from during that time? They came from southern China, from the small villages bearing the clan name, for example, the Moy village. And during the Chinese Exclusion Act, a bachelor society sprung up, and the men gathered together in the United States and banded together for survival by forming the family associations. Currently, as the president of the Family Association, Moy Family Association, DC, and during the advocacy of the Congressional Gold Medal, other Moys in the family came forth to tell their father's story. Now, their father served in all theaters of war, but mostly they served in the Army. Critically important was the training and preparation before going into war. Such was the case of Dr. Grant Moy Sr., who was studying to be a doctor when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. He immediately enlisted in the Army, and later, because of his extensive expertise in bone injuries, the Army assigned him to serve as chief of orthopedics at the hospital at Keesler Army Airfield in Mississippi. The airfield was a major training ground for airmen, and bone injuries resulted in a great need for orthopedic surgery. So Dr. Moy was very busy. Today, Dr. Grant Moy Sr. is still alive at the age of 103. Thank you for your service, Dr. Moy. Private First Class Henry K.L. Moy was born and raised in New York City and joined the Army. And he was trained at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and then was assigned to the 995th Field Artillery Battalion. With university degrees in economics and banking and finance, he was very skilled with numbers. So his specialty was the meticulous calculation of distance from the artillery to the enemy targets. He saw a grueling 472 days of combat that took him through Algeria, Tunisia, Italy, France, Germany, and Central Europe. In the next slide, Brigadier General Julian St. Clair Holbrook, a British Army officer, dispenses high praise for the accuracy of shooting and bombardment that assisted our allies, the British and the Polish troops. Private First Class Moy's instruments are set up for these calculations that you see on the right. In the next slide, Corporal Ham Moy told many stories to his young sons about his service in Normandy, and later he was awarded a Purple Heart. Private Moy Dupont is shown here being sworn in as a U.S. citizen on July 4th, 1944 in Lido, India. So I'm proud of my dad and the other fathers in my clan, and my dad's legacy is sustained and continued in our family by my mom, who's a war bride, and my brothers and me, and all the other Moys who followed in their father's footsteps. We are so proud of our families and remain stoically patriotic and proud Americans. Now, the collective Congressional Gold Medal, officially awarded recently, a couple of weeks ago on December 9th, in a virtual ceremony by House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, honors the Chinese American World War II veterans who served, sacrificed, and died in the service and duty to our nation in World War II. They served in all branches of service, including the Merchant Marines and all theaters of war, and defended our homeland. The Chinese American World War II Veterans Congressional Gold Medal is so well deserved as we honor the greatest generation. Thank you. Matt?
Thank you, Commander Moy. Now we will show a short video on the National Museum of the United States Army with a focus on how the museum tells the story of World War II.